Their work is not born of genius, it is born of trauma. On one side is Charlie Louvin, a singer haunted by the ghost of his dead brother, desperately searching for a female voice to fill the void of harmony. On the other side is Melba Montgomery, a vocal warrior, newly freed from the clutches of a male superstar, desperately searching for her own voice, not someone else's shadow. Their relationship is not a musical miracle, it is a brutal collision between a man searching for a ghost and a woman who refuses to be a ghost. Our story begins not in the neon glow of Nashville, but in the most isolated, unforgiving, and impoverished landscape imaginable. Section, Alabama, during the absolute depths of the Great Depression. Charles Elzer Loudermilk, whom the world would call Charlie, was born on July 7, 1927. He was the younger of two sons born to Charlie Sr. and Annie Loudermilk. His older brother, born 3 years earlier in 1924, was Ira. The family was, in a word, poor, not just country poor, but Alabama mountain tenant farmer poor. This was a poverty that was biblical. It was a poverty of dirt floors and patched-up clothes, of meager meals and relentless grinding debt. Their father, Charlie Sr., was a tenant farmer, which meant he worked land he would never own, forever in debt to the landlord. When the farm failed, as it often did in the drought-stricken 1930s, he worked in the coal mines. This is the trauma. This is the psychological bedrock of the entire Louvin story. Charlie, the younger brother, was born into this world of immediate, crushing chaos. From the age of 8, he was not a child. He was a laborer. He was in the fields alongside his father, his small body already accumulating the chronic back pain that would follow him for the rest of his life. This experience, this daily struggle for simple survival, did two things to him. First, it instilled in him a wound we have seen before in these stories, a deep, obsessive, lifelong terror of financial insecurity. He was a workaholic from childhood, not by choice, but by necessity. He became and would remain obsessed with control, particularly financial control. He had seen what it was to have nothing, to be at the mercy of the weather and the landowner. He vowed in his quiet, steady way that he would never, ever be that powerless again. This drive would later fuel his relentless management of the Louvin brothers' career, and it would reemerge in his brief, hopeful partnership with Melba Montgomery. Second, his voice. His tenor is perfectly described as weary resilient. This is a perfect description, and it was born here. It wasn't the voice of a man who had read about hardship. It was the voice of a man who had lived it from his first breath. It was the sound of the red Alabama clay, the sound of exhaustion. It was the sound of knowing the sun would come up tomorrow and the work would be just as hard. It was a voice of pure, unvarnished reality. But in the Loudermilk cabin, there was another, far more powerful and far more dangerous force at play than poverty. It was the crushing, rigid doctrine of their father's fundamentalist Baptist faith. Charlie Sr. was a man of the Old Testament. He was deeply religious, strict, unyielding, and saw the world in a terrifying binary code. There was God, and there was Satan. There was the sacred, and there was the profane. There was no in-between. For Charlie Sr., the labor of the farm and the mine was godly. It was pure. It was the Lord's work and music. In his father's rigid doctrine, it was a frivolous distraction. It was worse than that. Secular music, the hillbilly songs played on the radio, the blues, the songs played in bars where people danced and drank and lusted, that was not just frivolous. That was the devil's work. It was a direct path to damnation. This created the central, impossible, and defining conflict of their lives, faith versus fame. For the two young brothers, music was their only escape. It was the only sliver of beauty in a gray, joyless world of labor. Their mother Annie was the one who gave them the key. She taught them to sing. She taught them the high, lonesome, sacred harmonies of the church. This was their sanctuary. They would sing gospel songs together, and a kind of holy magic happened. Ira, the older brother, was a prodigy. He was a channel. He seemed to have been born with music in his fingers and his throat. He was a savant, a brilliant, natural musician who could, by all accounts, pick up a mandolin and make it weep. And his voice was something not of this earth. It was a tenor so high, so pure, so sharp it could shatter glass and break your heart in the same note. Charlie, in contrast, was the anchor, the steady half whose clear, resilient tenor provided the earthly foundation for Ira's fire. When they sang together, their voices locked in a way that was almost supernatural. It was a blood harmony, a sound so perfect, so intertwined, it felt like a single angelic voice. This harmony was their refuge. It was their escape from the poverty, from the labor, and from the suffocating judgment of their father. When they sang, they were, for a few brief moments, perfect. But even in this sacred sanctuary, the dynamic that would one day destroy them was already set. Ira was the brilliant one, the volatile one, the star. Charlie was the steady one, the responsible one, the partner. This wasn't just a friendly rivalry. It was a competition for attention. In a family of crushing poverty, attention is a currency, and Ira, with his blinding talent, always got more. Charlie, the younger brother, was already learning his role, to support, to steady, and to live in the shadow of his brother's genius. Their first radio appearances, as teenagers on WNOX in Knoxville, were singing these pure, sacred gospel songs. They were a local sensation. They were the Loudermilk Brothers, the angelic farm boys. But as they got older, they heard the other sounds crackling over the radio. They heard the hillbilly hits. They heard the secular songs that were making men like Roy Acuff and Hank Williams into stars. They saw that these men weren't just singing for God. They were singing for money. They were singing for fame. They wanted that too. And in their father's strict Baptist mind, that was the moment they chose ambition over faith. That was the moment they, his sons, chose Satan. This conflict was not a simple teenage rebellion. It became the central toxic fuel of their art. The Louvin brothers' entire sound would be a constant, agonizing battle between the sacred songs their mother taught them and the secular devil's music their father despised. They would release an album of pure gospel and follow it with an album of pure honky-tonk cheating songs. They were a walking contradiction, and for Ira, the brilliant, unstable prodigy, this conflict was not metaphorical. It was literal. This is the great dark secret of the story. As a teenager, Ira began to drink heavily. This was his secret act of rebellion against his severe, teetotaler father. But in Ira's mind, a mind already steeped in the fire and brimstone guilt of his upbringing, this was not just drinking, it was a mortal sin. By drinking and singing secular music, Ira Louvin reportedly became convinced on a fundamental, unshakable level that he was literally, truly, eternally damned. He believed he was working for Satan. Guilt was a living, breathing monster inside him. He would drink to numb the guilt, and alcohol only proved his damnation, which made him drink more. It was a perfect psychological trap, impossible to escape. And this satanic guilt was the engine that led to his downfall. And Charlie was stuck with him. He was the good brother, the responsible one who didn't drink. His job was to sober Ira, to hide the bottles, and to apologize to the radio executives, the one who had to absorb Ira's increasingly violent, alcoholic rages. The dynamic that would soon conquer Nashville was not built on brotherhood. From the start, it was a codependent, abusive relationship, hidden behind the most beautiful sound in the world. The setting for this tragedy, the battle between a vengeful God and human ambition, was set in the Baptist firehouse of Section, Alabama. But the story doesn't end there. At that very moment, just a short distance away, just across the state line, another story was beginning. A different kind of survivor was being created. Our second path begins not far away, in the harsh hills of Iron City, Tennessee, a small, gritty town that clings to the Alabama border. This is where Melba Joyce Montgomery was born on October 14th, 1938. If the Louvin story is a Gothic novel, a psychological horror of two brothers bound by a single angelic, toxic sound, Melba's story is a different kind of war. It is not a war against Satan. It is a war against the system. It's a story of gender, of aesthetics, and of a woman who was told her entire life in 1,000 different ways that she was simply fundamentally wrong. Like Charlie and Ira, she was born into poverty. She was the youngest of 6 children in a poor farming family. And like the Louvin, her house was filled with music. Her father, a part-time amateur musician and a full-time laborer, often working in the mines, taught her the guitar. Her mother, like Annie Loudermilk, sang the old-time ballads and gospel hymns. The parallels are striking, but the wounds they created are critically different. Melba grew up in the era of post-war austerity. The Great Depression had bled into World War II, and its rationing and make-do mentality defined her childhood. She too was a laborer from the age of 8, working alongside her family. But this life of toil and this poverty isolation of being the youngest of 6 created something very different than the weary, resilient sound it forged in Charlie. In a house with 6 children and not enough of anything, not enough food, not enough money, not enough space, a quiet child is an invisible child. A quiet child starves. A loud child, a sassy child, a child with a fiery, tough personality. That is the child who gets noticed. That is the child who gets fed. Her personality was not a choice. It was a survival tool. And this tool was perfectly matched to her voice. She had what's perfectly described as a vocal roughness. Melba's voice was not ethereal. It was not angelic. It was earthy. It was the sound of the Tennessee dirt, the sound of the gospel tent, but it was mixed with the defiant, bluesy wail of a Jimmy Rogers yodel. It was a voice that demanded to be heard. This was her first great conflict. The Louvins' conflict was internal, their faith versus their fame. Melba's was external, her reality versus the industry's ideal. And the ideal, in the 1940s and 50s, was very, very specific for women. This is the central defining wound of Melba Montgomery's life. It wasn't the fallen woman scandal that Kitty Wells had feared. It was, perhaps, something even more fundamental, and in many ways more cruel. It was the crushing, ever-present, internalized self-doubt of being not pretty enough. In the emerging Nashville system, girl singers were meant to be just that, pretty. They were meant to be soft, photogenic, demure. They were meant to be the visual feminine counterpoint to the male star. They were, like Patsy Cline in her early pre-legend days, packaged by men in gingham dresses, their voices often smoothed and polished by producers to remove any offensive grit. They were, in short, a product to be looked at as much as listened to. Melba Montgomery could not and would not fit into this box. She wasn't pretty in the conventional way, but striking, not sweet, but sassy. Her voice wasn't polished, it was defiantly raw. And so, from her earliest days, she was told by the world that she was wrong. Her voice was too rough. Her style was too country. Her looks were not commercial. This constant rejection, this aesthetic judgment, was not just professional criticism, it was a deep psychological wound. It was a daily message that her authenticity, the very thing that made her Melba, was a liability. This psychological furnace forged her armor. If the Louvin brothers' compensation for their wounds was their perfect, unearthly harmony, Melba's compensation was her defiant, unshakable, tough woman persona. It was a classic of preemptive strike. Her fiery, tough style was a defense mechanism, a preemptive strike. If the world told her she wasn't pretty, she would in response be powerful. But this armor protected an even deeper, more crucial ambition, one that also sprang from her wound of poverty. Like Charlie Louvin, she was obsessed with financial stability, but her solution was radically different. Charlie, haunted by his father's failure, sought security, a fortress to hide inside, a stable paycheck from the Opry, a partnership that worked. Melba, the woman constantly told she was not viable on her own, craved independence. She would not hide. She would own. And this is the key to her entire life. She knew instinctively that her voice, her rough voice, and her face, her not pretty face, would always be at the mercy of male producers and male stars who wanted to use them. Her true power, her path to independence, the one thing that was undeniably hers, was her pen. She became a songwriter. This was her fortress. A song was an asset. A song was power. A song, as she would one day prove with her masterpiece No Charge, was something she could create, she could own, and she could control in a way she could never control her own public image or the industry's perception of her. This drive for financial independence, born of poverty and forged in the fires of sexism, was her core motivation. Her early career was a perfect and painful illustration of this conflict. She was a prodigy, just like Ira Louvin. She was on the radio by age 10 in 1948, singing on WJOI in Florence, Alabama. She was already building a local fan base, her sassy vocal and Jimmy Rogers-influenced yodel making her a local curiosity. She sang with her brothers, learning the gospel blues harmonies her mother had taught her. She was, for a moment, a child star. But what does that early talent get a not pretty girl in a man's industry? As she grew into a young woman, the child star curiosity faded, and the harsh reality of the industry set in. The failure motif, which we saw with Charlie, became her reality. She was constantly told that her act was a gimmick. This is a profound, almost novelistic parallel. It is the secret tragedy of authenticity in a commercial world. In Alabama, Charlie Louvin, the good brother with the angelic voice, was spending his days as a farmhand, his failure hidden from the public, his sacred gift deemed frivolous. In Tennessee, Melba Montgomery, the sassy girl with the powerful, rough voice, was spending her days waiting tables, her talent ignored, her style deemed not commercial. Both were musical geniuses, reduced to manual labor by an industry that didn't yet have a box for them. Both were simmering with frustration. Charlie was frustrated by his father's religious judgment. Melba was frustrated by the industry's gender bias. She was constantly told that her act was a gimmick. She was a girl trying to sing a man's style. She was a hillbilly in an age that was frantically trying to invent the slick pop country Nashville sound. This frustration, this cycle of failure and day jobs, is what built the survivor. She was not fragile. She was not a victim. She was pragmatic. She was tough, and she was angry. She knew she couldn't break into the good old boys club alone. She knew her rough voice and not pretty face were not enough for them. So she made a calculated, strategic decision. It was, in essence, the same decision Kitty Wells had made, but for different reasons. Kitty had sought protection in a partnership. Melba was seeking a platform. She needed an inch. If the industry would not accept her as a solo artist, she would force them to accept her by attaching herself to the biggest, most undeniable male star she could find. She would use the very system that was trying to reject her. This is the decision that led her, in 1962, to sign with United Artists. She was now a single mother, struggling to get by, navigating marital difficulties, and she was about to tie her career to the most brilliant and most volatile male voice in the entire genre. A man who was, in his own way, just as haunted, just as alcoholic, and just as dangerous as Ira Louvin. She was about to enter her own parallel hell, a hell defined by George Jones, which was itself forged by the two parallel hells of the decade from 1950 to 1969, 1963. While Charlie Louvin was living the angelic lie in Nashville, Melba Montgomery was making her own sassy bargain by tying herself to George Jones. Unknowingly, they were living parallel nightmares. For Charlie and Ira Louvin, the late 1940s and early 1950s were a continuation of the same frustrating grind they had always known. They had moved to Nashville, changed their name from the two-country Loudermilk to the sleeker, more marketable Louvin brothers, and were hustling, but Nashville was not ready for them. This is a critical, often overlooked part of their legend. They were not an instant success. They were, in fact, spectacular failures. They got a spot on the Grand Ole Opry in the early 50s, but they quickly lost their slot. Why? Because the gatekeepers of the industry, the men in suits who were already formulating the smooth, string-laden Nashville sound, found the Louvins' harmony to be offensive. It was, they were told, too raw, too high, too shrill, too hillbilly. It was the same rejection Melba Montgomery was facing for her rough voice. The Louvins' sound, that sacred supernatural blood harmony, was considered primitive, uncommercial, and backward. Defeated, and with Charlie's failure complex now raging, they retreated from Nashville, moving to Memphis to work day jobs. Charlie, the good brother, was, once again, a farmhand. His worst fear, the echo of his father's judgment, was his reality. The dream, it seemed, was over. But in 1955, one producer at Capitol Records, Ken Nelson, decided to take a risk on the Hillbilly Act. He signed them. That same year, propelled by their new label backing, they were invited back to the Grand Ole Opry, this time as full official members. The dam broke. The world, it turned out, was starving for the very sound the gatekeepers had rejected. The Louvin brothers, now in their late 20s and early 30s, exploded. The hits were not just songs, they were foundational texts of the genre. When I stop dreaming, I don't believe you've met my baby. My baby's gone. Cash on the Barrelhead. They were superstars. Their harmony was, without question, the most influential in music history. It was the bridge from the old-time brother duets of the 1930s to the future of rock and roll. A young Elvis Presley, also in Memphis, was a devoted fan. He would later cover their songs. The Everly Brothers, just a few years later, would build their entire global career on a pop version of the Louvins' sacred secular sound. Charlie Louvin had done it. He had won. The boy from the tenant farm, the man haunted by his father's scorn and the terror of financial failure, was now one of the biggest, most respected, and most financially secure artists in the world. He was the co-leader of a musical revolution. And this is where the lie is finally fatally exposed. The lie was the sound. The sound was angelic, pure, perfect. The truth was a violent, alcoholic, psychological war. The more successful they became, the more Ira Louvin, the brilliant, unstable prodigy, disintegrated. That Satan guilt from his childhood, the belief that he was damned for singing secular music, was not a metaphor. It was a delusion. He was a man at war with his own soul, and the fame, the money, the adoration, it was in his mind just more proof of his deal with the devil. He drank to numb the guilt. He drank to silence the voice of his father in his head, and the alcohol unleashed a terrifying, violent rage. Ira Louvin was not a troubled artist. He was a monster. He became famously the most self-destructive man in Nashville in an era filled with self-destructive men. His drunken furies were legendary. He would, in the middle of a set, fly into a rage, cursing the audience for applauding the devil's music. He would frequently smash his instrument, his beautiful, expensive mandolin, the very source of his genius, into splinters on the stage, screaming in a language of pure alcoholic guilt. He would get into brawls. He would vanish for days. His personal life was a smoking crater. After a particularly brutal drunken fight with his third wife, Faye, she reportedly took a .22 pistol and shot him 6 times in the chest and shoulder. And he survived. When the police arrived, Ira, bleeding on the floor, reportedly told them, "If I live, I'll see that she doesn't do it again." Even in near death, he was threatening. This was the hell Charlie Louvin was living. This was the family dysfunction he had to mask every single day to keep the angelic brand alive. This is the key to Charlie's wound. He was not a partner. He was a keeper. He was an enabler. He was a victim. While Ira was the star, Charlie was the workaholic. He was the one, driven by his terror of failure, who managed the books. He was the one who had to apologize to the Opry managers. He was the one who had to pay the promoters for the smashed instruments and broken hotel rooms. He was the one who had to drive the car, as Ira was almost always too drunk. And he was the one who had to endure the violence. Yes, Ira was violent with Charlie. This wasn't a friendly rivalry over lead vocals. This was a classic, terrifying case of domestic abuse, trapped in a harmony. Ira, the older, dominant brother, would beat him. Charlie, the good brother, the anchor, would take it. Why? Why would he stay? Because of the harmony. Because of the blood. Because of the wound of poverty. Because in his mind, his entire identity, his fame, his financial security, his very self was tied to his abuser. To leave Ira was to go back to being a farmhand. To leave Ira was to fail. He was a prisoner, bound by the 2 most powerful forces in his life: his love for their perfect sacred sound and his terror of his brother's demonic violence. This living hell continued for 8 spectacular, agonizing years. Finally, in 1963, Charlie couldn't take it anymore. The good brother finally broke. After a particularly brutal fight, a fight that reportedly became physical backstage at a show, Charlie issued an ultimatum: "It's me or the bottle." Ira, in a moment of tragic, career-ending honesty, chose the bottle. The Louvin brothers, at the absolute peak of their fame and influence, violently disbanded. Charlie Louvin was, for the first time in his 36 years, free. He was free from the violence. He was free from the terror. He was free from the constant, suffocating anxiety of managing his brother's demons. He was also, for the first time in his adult life, musically alone. The harmony was gone. His identity was gone. He was a man standing in a silent, terrifying void. And at that exact same time, Melba Montgomery was living her own version of this nightmare. She was 24 years old. She was a single mother. She was a waitress. And she was, as the industry had repeatedly told her, too rough and not pretty enough to be a star. She had fought her way to a contract with United Artists, but her first singles had failed. She was on the verge of being dropped, of being sent back to the diner for good. She was, like Charlie, facing failure. So she made her sassy bargain. If the industry wouldn't let her in the front door as a solo act, she would kick in the side door as a duet partner. Her label decided to pair her with the biggest, most volatile, and most universally respected voice in the entire genre, George Jones. George Jones in 1963 was George Jones. He was the possum. He was, like Ira Louvin, a legendary no-show alcoholic, and he was possessive. He was known for his controlling, jealous rages and his toxic relationships with his female singing partners. He was, in short, Ira Louvin in a different suit, and Melba Montgomery, the tough woman, the survivor, was thrown into the ring with him. The label needed a song. Melba, the songwriter, was ready. She and Jones co-wrote a song that perfectly captured the fiery, out-of-control nature of their partnership. It was called "We Must Have Been Out of Our Minds." The song was released in 1963. It was an instant, massive #3 smash hit. The chemistry was undeniable. Their voices, his soaring, tortured, almost maniacal tenor, and her defiant, earthy alto, were a perfect electric match. It was not a sacred harmony like the Louvin. It was a secular one. It was the sound of a bar fight, of a passionate train wreck of a relationship. It was real. Melba Montgomery, the waitress, was now a star. She had made it. But just like Charlie Louvin, this success was a lie. The sound was electric. The reality was toxic. She was now shackled to a man who saw her as his property. She was in a constant internal fight. George was possessive. He drank. He was controlling. He was, in essence, trying to do to Melba what Ira had done to Charlie, make her the anchor, the keeper, the lesser half of his act. But Melba Montgomery was not Charlie Louvin. This is the critical difference that defines their entire stories. Charlie, the good brother, was codependent. He was bound by blood and guilt. His identity was fused with his partner's. Melba, the tough woman, was fiercely independent. She was not bound by blood. She was a professional. She was not there to save George Jones. She was there to build her own career. While Charlie endured Ira's abuse, Melba fought Jones. She did not let her identity be subsumed. She did not become George's girl singer. In the exact same year that "We Must Have Been Out of Our Minds" was a smash hit, Melba, the songwriter, released her own solo song. It was called "Hall of Shame." It was a top 10 hit. This was an incredible act of defiance. She was, in effect, competing with her own duet partner on the same charts. She was establishing her own separate brand. She was telling the world, and she was telling George Jones, "I am not your harmony. I am Melba Montgomery." Look at this parallel. It is the key to their entire story. In the year 1963, two of the greatest harmony singers in Nashville were at a breaking point, trapped in parallel hells. Charlie Louvin was escaping his brilliant, abusive, alcoholic partner, Ira, and in doing so was losing his entire identity. Melba Montgomery was battling her brilliant, abusive, alcoholic partner, George, and in doing so was forging her own. Both were survivors. Both were, in their own way, fleeing for their lives. And then, just as Charlie was taking his first tentative steps as a solo artist, the ghost that would come to haunt him was made real, permanent, and inescapable. Charlie Louvin was free. The year was 1964. He had signed his own solo deal with Capitol Records. He was, for the first time, in control. That childhood terror of poverty was, for the moment, stable. He was his own boss, and he was a success. His first solo single, "I Don't Love You Anymore," was a top 5 hit. He followed it in 1965 with See the Big Man Cry, another top 10 hit. It seemed for a moment that he had done the impossible. He had escaped the shadow. He had proven he wasn't just Ira's keeper. He was a star in his own right. He was finally just Charlie. And Ira? Ira was on a 2-year, self-destructive alcoholic spiral. He had lost his good brother, his anchor, his keeper, and he was in a free fall. We already know how Ira died in that 1965 car crash. But for Charlie, that tragedy was not an ending. It was the beginning of another prison. It was the wound from which Charlie Louvin would never, ever recover. His freedom was now a death sentence. His grief was not simple. It was not the sadness of losing a brother. It was a suffocating, complex psychological storm of survivor's guilt. It was the guilt of leaving. If I had stayed, he must have thought, would he still be alive? It was the guilt of success. I had hits while he was falling apart. It was, most profoundly, the guilt of relief. The monster who had beaten him, terrorized him, and controlled him was gone. He was finally truly safe. And that safety felt, in its own way, like a betrayal. This was the moment Ira Louvin ceased to be a memory and became a ghost. Ira's death erased Charlie's new solo identity. He was no longer Charlie Louvin, the solo star. He was once again, and now forever, Charlie Louvin, the surviving member of the Louvin brothers. His solo career, which had started so strong, now began to slow. The hits faded, leaving him a harmony singer defined by an absence, a man haunted by the screaming, silent void where Ira's tenor used to be. And as Charlie was entering this new grief-stricken void, Melba Montgomery was also entering a new phase. She, too, had finally, permanently escaped the toxic orbit of George Jones. She was a free agent. The wound of gender bias still oozed inside her. But Melba, the ultimate pragmatist, didn't seek another volatile artistic alliance. Instead, she sought stability. In 1968, as her professional life was still in flux, she made a move that was the complete opposite of a sassy bargain. She married Jack Solomon, a businessman who operated outside the direct, volatile spotlight of the Nashville charts. This was not a strategic merger of talent, like the one she was falsely accused of. It was a partnership built on a foundation of private stability. This long, supportive, and quiet marriage, which would last for 46 years until Solomon's death in 2014, became the emotional and personal anchor she had never had. This stability was her new fortress. It was the move that fundamentally separated her from the tragedies of men like Charlie Louvin. She was not seeking a partner to complete her sound. She was building a life that allowed her to fight for her career on her own terms. This new private peace, however, did not immediately solve her public career limbo. She was stable at home, but still searching for a platform. And so, in 1970, when Charlie Louvin, a man still drowning in his own past, approached her, Melba, the secure professional, saw it for what it was, not salvation, but a high-profile gig. On one side, we have Charlie Louvin. He is 43. He is a man haunted by a ghost. His solo career is failing. He is desperate. He is lonely. He needs to fill the high, silent tenor void left by Ira. He needs salvation. He needs to sing that harmony again, just to feel whole. Let us understand the geography of this man's soul. For nearly 20 years, his entire identity had been one half of a perfect supernatural sound. He was the good brother, the anchor, the steady tenor that allowed his brother Ira's brilliant demonic mandolin and high angelic voice to soar. He was the earthly, weary, resilient half of the Louvin brothers. But that partnership, as we know, was a psychological hell. It was a waking nightmare of codependent abuse, of violent alcoholic rages, of smashed instruments, and of a shared toxic Satan guilt. In 1963, Charlie had finally blessedly escaped, but the escape was a false freedom. Just 2 years later, in 1965, Ira was killed, smashed head-on by a drunk driver. And in that instant, Charlie's identity was erased. His freedom became a life sentence. The ghost of Ira, the man who had been his abuser, his partner, his cross to bear, and his voice, was now his permanent silent companion. His solo career, which had started strong in the mid-60s with hits like See the Big Man Cry, was now flopping. The 1970s were dawning, and the world was moving on. The music landscape was now about the leather and denim grit of the outlaw movement, or the slick pop country of Glenn Campbell. Charlie Louvin, with his high, lonesome, sacred sound, was a relic. He was a harmony singer with no one to harmonize with. This was not just a career problem. This was an existential crisis. The wound of his childhood, that deep primal terror of poverty, of being a failure in his father's eyes, was roaring back. A flopping solo career meant no security. It meant a return to the farmhand status he had fled. He was a 43-year-old man, a legend, and he was terrified of going broke. But even deeper than that was the sound, the silence. He was a man defined not by his presence, but by an absence. In every song he sang, in every chord he played, there was a high, keening void where Ira's harmony was supposed to be. He was a man out of balance. He was lonely. He was haunted. He needed to fill that void. He needed to sing with someone. He needed redemption. He was filled with a profound, gnawing regret over the breakup of the Louvin. Perhaps he thought if he could just find a new harmony, he could prove that he was not the failure. He could, in a way, bring his brother back. He was a man looking for a ghost. And so he went to the one place in Nashville that is a sanctuary for ghosts and survivors, the Grand Ole Opry. And Melba Montgomery, the ultimate survivor, was in that very same sanctuary, looking for her own path forward. The idea came from Charlie. He was 43. He was the elder statesman, a living legend. He saw Melba, and he didn't just see a talented woman, he saw a solution. He heard her voice. It was not Ira's. It was the opposite of Ira's. Ira's voice was a high, pure, angelic tenor. Melba's was a sassy, rough, earthy, blues-inflected alto. Perhaps this was the key. He could not replace Ira. That would be a sacrilege. But perhaps he could counter him. Perhaps this fiery, tough sound could be the thing to fill the other side of his voice, to create something entirely new. It would be his redemption. He approached her. He was Charlie Louvin, a name that opened every door. He was respectful, weary, and in his heart, desperate. He was the mentor, the man who had survived Ira, now looking to start again. He proposed they form a duet. Now, we must enter Melba's mind. She was the ultimate pragmatist. She was not blinded by the Louvin legacy. She had just barely escaped the orbit of George Jones. The last thing she was looking for was another partnership. But this was Charlie Louvin. This was not a romantic proposal. This was a business proposition. A duet with Charlie Louvin meant an instant major label record deal at his label, Capitol. It meant a guaranteed album. It meant high-profile tour dates. It meant a platform. For Melba, the tough woman, the survivor who needed independence, this was a smart, strategic, and most importantly, temporary move. This was a high-profile gig that could relaunch her solo career, the career that had always been her primary ambition. She was not emotionally invested. She was a professional looking for a job. He was a man haunted, looking for a ghost. This was not a partnership. It was a transaction. And it was based on a fundamental tragic misunderstanding. They signed with Capitol Records in 1970. They went into the studio, and immediately the subtle power imbalance became the central unspoken conflict. Let us be clear. Charlie was not Ira. He was the good brother. He was kind. He was professional. He was emotional. He would never, ever repeat Ira's violence. The fear of that, the deep, abiding trauma, was what now masked his new form of control. His control was not abusive. It was paternalistic. He was the elder statesman. He was the mentor. He was the Louvin. And this was his project, his redemption. He instinctively took the role of leader. He would guide Melba's harmonies. He would arrange the songs. He was, in his mind, the producer. He was, in his gentle, weary way, trying to control the sound to make it fit the perfect Ira-shaped void in his head. He was, in essence, trying to direct Melba to be the new Ira. But Melba Montgomery was perhaps the single last woman on earth who would tolerate being guided. She was Melba Montgomery. She was the tough woman with the fiery soul. She was not a student. She was not a sidekick. She was a peer. She had her own sound. She had her own ambitions. And she would not be controlled, not even by the gentle, grieving ghost of a Louvin. This was the subtle power struggle. It wasn't a shouting match like with Ira or Jones. It was a quiet backstage war of attrition. We can imagine the scenes in the studio. Charlie closing his eyes, hearing Ira's angelic harmony in his head, turning to Melba and saying, "No, honey, the note is up here. It needs to be purer." And Melba, the sassy pragmatist, her armor immediately going up, saying, "That's not my voice, Charlie. I'll sing it here." Charlie, terrified of the conflict, would back down. But he would be resentful. This wasn't right. This wasn't the sound. This wasn't the redemption he was looking for. Melba, feeling stifled, feeling once again like a girl singer being handled by a man, would already be planning her exit. She had empathy for his grief, but she would not be its sacrifice. This compromise, this tension, is the sound you hear on the record. Their one and only album, Something to Brag About, was released in 1971. The lead single, the title track, is a perfect, tragic illustration of this disconnect. The song itself is a classic. It's a call and response duet, where the two singers take turns, bragging about each other. Charlie sings, "I've got a woman who's better than she looks. She's a wizard in the kitchen." Melba sings, "I've got a man who's a sight to see. He's a lover, a fighter, a real go-getter." It is literally a song about a perfect, mutually supportive, flawless partnership. And it was a lie. It was the opposite of their reality. Their partnership was not something to brag about. It was a transaction. It was a compromise. It was a power struggle. And the public felt it. The sound was a good blend. It was interesting. Charlie's emotional tenor did mesh with Melba's sassy roughness, but it was hollow. It was the sound of two professionals who did not trust each other, singing a song about perfect trust. It did not have the high-wire, terrifying, sacred, secular truth of the Louvin brothers. It did not have the raw, violent, train wreck passion of her duets with George Jones. It was just nice, and nice doesn't sell. The album was a commercial flop. This was the verdict. This was the market speaking. The album peaked at a dismal number 45 on the charts. Their lead single, "Did You Ever?" barely scraped to number 26. The other songs, "Baby, You've Got What It Takes," "We Must Be Crazy," they vanished. The album was a failure by the standards of a Louvin or a Jones. The commercial flop was not just a business failure, it was a psychological verdict. The audience, in its collective wisdom, had rejected the ghost. They didn't want Charlie Louvin +1. They didn't want a replacement Ira. They wanted the real thing, the warring, brilliant, sacred, and dangerous Louvin brothers. And if they couldn't have that, they didn't want this hollow substitute. The failure was not Melba's fault. It was not even Charlie's fault. It was Ira's. The ghost had won. The collaboration, which had begun with such high hopes, ended as it began, as a business decision. By 1972, after less than 2 years, it just stopped. There was no Satan is real explosion. There was no I will always love you moment. There were no lawsuits. There was no drama. It was a simple flop. Capitol Records, seeing the low sales, quietly dropped the Duet series. Melba Montgomery, the ultimate pragmatist, the tough woman who had seen the writing on the wall, did what she had always done. She survived. She saw that this platform was a dead end. Her solo ambitions were primary. She respectfully, professionally, and immediately walked away. And Charlie Louvin? On a gray afternoon in Nashville in 1971, he was once again 44 years old, and he was once again alone. His grand experiment had failed. His attempt at redemption had been rejected. His hope of filling the void, of silencing the ghost, had been a commercial flop. He was, as he would later admit, out of his mind with regret. Regret for the original breakup. Regret for this failed revival. The public, the industry, and even his new partner had all, in their own ways, given him the same terrible definitive answer. Without Ira, he was nothing. And for a man haunted by the terror of failure, it seemed like the ultimate crushing tragedy. He was once again the good brother, finally defeated, left alone in the wreckage. For Charlie, it was the final, definitive, painful proof that he could not recapture the past. He could not find a replacement for Ira. He could not fill the high, angelic, demonic void his brother had left. The ghost, the one he had been chasing, the one he had tried to sing with, would not answer. For Melba, it was the final test. She had been tested by the industry's bias. And now she had been tested by the heavy, sorrowful legacy of a legend. And she had once again held her own, refused to be molded, and walked away intact. The short failed duet was not a beginning, it was a graduation. From that moment in 1971, their parallel paths, which had briefly, transactionally intersected, now diverged forever. And on these new separate paths, both, finally free from the ghosts of their most toxic partnerships, would go on to achieve their true legacies. And those legacies were, just like their wounds, perfectly, ironically opposed. Melba Montgomery's path was one of immediate, explosive, and validating triumph. Charlie Louvin's path was one of a long, slow, and profound reckoning. Let us first follow Melba. She was now free from toxic professional partnerships and supported by a stable private life. But on her own, in the Nashville of 1971, was a cold, hard, and lonely place for a woman like her. The wound of her childhood, that systematic judgment that she was not pretty enough, too rough, not commercial, was still a daily reality. The industry was now in the full flower of the countrypolitan era, a sound defined by the lush, string-laden, pop-perfect productions of artists like Lynn Anderson and the emerging Olivia Newton-John. And here was Melba Montgomery. She was the anti-Rose Garden. She was the sassy, tough woman with the vocal roughness, a holdover from the hillbilly era they were trying to pave over. She was a single mother in an industry that sold fantasies of virginal girl singers. She was in every way a hard sell. Her previous duets, while they had given her a platform, had also reinforced a toxic narrative. She was a component, a girl singer who only worked as a foil to a dominant male star, first Jones, then Louvin. Now that she was alone, the industry by and large shrugged. She was in the wilderness. She was still a member of the Opry, still respected, but she was not a priority for any label. She was, like Charlie, facing the very real failure she had fought her entire life. But Melba had one thing Charlie didn't. She had an armor that was not dependent on another person's voice. Her compensation for her wounds was not a harmony, it was her independence. And the engine of that independence, the weapon she had been sharpening in secret her entire life, was her pen. She was a songwriter. This was her fortress. This was the one part of her career the male gatekeepers couldn't touch, couldn't judge by her face, and couldn't dismiss as not pretty. A great song was a great song. It was pure, undeniable power. It was her path to the financial independence her wound of poverty so deeply craved. And in 1974, her masterpiece arrived. It came not from a collaboration, but as an act of ultimate validation. The legendary songwriter Harlan Howard, the man the stories often confused her with, had written a song. He wrote it alone. It wasn't a song, but a monologue, a small, devastating 4-minute domestic play called No Charge. As the true story goes, Harlan Howard reportedly wrote the song specifically for Melba. He heard her voice, that rough, emotional voice the industry had deemed not commercial, and knew she was the only one on earth who could deliver its matriarchal truth. She took it into the studio. Her performance was so raw, so real, that it reportedly made the veteran studio musicians weep as they played. This was not a song. This was a manifesto. It begins with her young son, who hands his mother an itemized bill for the chores he's done around the house, for mowing the lawn $5, for making my own bed this week $1, for raking the leaves $2, for getting a good report card $5. The total, he says, is $14.75. The mother, and here Melba's rough, emotional voice is not singing, it is speaking with the quiet, weary authority of a million mothers. She doesn't get angry. She doesn't scold him. She just looks at him, takes the pen, and on the back of his bill she begins to write her own invoice. For the 9 months I carried you growing inside me, no charge. For the nights I sat up with you, doctored you, prayed for you, no charge. For the time and the tears and the cost through the years, no charge. For the toys, the food, the clothes, and for wiping your nose, no charge. She continues cataloging the small, invisible, and infinite labors of motherhood, ending with the devastating line, and when you add it all up, the full cost of my love is no charge. The song ends with the little boy, his eyes filled with tears, turning the bill over, and on the amount due line, he writes in big letters, paid in full. It was the ultimate anthem of female worth, delivered not with a political shout, but with a mother's unassailable, quiet authority. It was the perfect, brilliant expression of her entire life's wound. It was the ultimate statement of financial independence. By arguing that her true value was, in fact, beyond all finance, it was the tough woman revealing for the first time that her armor was built on love. The song was released in 1974. It was an explosion. It was a cultural earthquake. It didn't just climb the country charts, it flew to #1. It then crossed over to the pop charts, hitting the top 40. It was an international smash. Melba Montgomery, the sassy girl who wasn't pretty enough, the single mother who was a hard sell, the failed duet partner of Charlie Louvin. She was now at 36 years old, a #1 million-selling Grammy-nominated solo superstar. She had at last proven her female viability, and she had done it completely, totally, and defiantly on her own terms. She had not done it with a man's voice, she had done it with her own pen. This hit cemented her legacy. She was no longer just a girl singer or a duet partner. She was undeniably one of the most important female songwriters of her generation. The failure of the Louvin Duet was not a setback, it was the catalyst. It was the last toxic partnership she had to survive before she could finally claim her own crown. She had won. She continued to tour, continued to record, and became a beloved Opry guest for the rest of her life. After a lifetime of fighting against being defined by her male partners, her immortality was ultimately secured by the very thing that started her journey, family harmony. Melba's path was a triumph. But for Charlie Louvin, the path after 1971 was not one of triumph. It was a long, slow, and profound reckoning. The verdict was in. Charlie Louvin, at 44, was alone. The Melba Duet, his last desperate attempt to fill the void, had failed. The industry, the public, and his partner had all confirmed his deepest fear. Just Charlie was not enough. He was, once and for all, the harmony singer with no harmony, a man defined by absence. This failure, this hitting of rock bottom, was not an end. It was a terrible, necessary choice. He could fade into obscurity, a broken man before 50, or he could find a new identity. He chose the latter. He could no longer be a star. So he became an institution. He retreated to the one place that would always have him, the one place where his past was not a burden, but a badge of honor, the Grand Ole Opry. This was his new compensation. This was his new fortress. Charlie Louvin, a workaholic driven by insecurity, could no longer sell records. So he would work the Opry. He became an Opry staple till death. This was not a glamorous life. This was a grind. It was the life of a working musician. He would show up week after week, month after month, year after year. For nearly 50 years, he was the reliable one. He was Mr. Charlie. This new life, this long, quiet walk as a living legend, was his job. It was the stable, weekly paycheck his father had always told him to get. It was the ultimate, ironic fulfillment of his deepest wound. He had at last found security, but it was also his therapy. It was in this period, the long, hitless flop years of the 1970s and 1980s, that he finally, painfully, began to reckon with the ghost. He could no longer sing with Ira. The duet with Melba had proven that. The public had forbidden it. So instead, he began to talk about him. For decades, Charlie Louvin had been the keeper of the lie. He was the good brother, the one who had masked the family dysfunction. He had hidden Ira's battles to protect their sacred image. He had silently, stoically endured the abuse, the alcoholism, the rages, the smashed mandolins, the terror, all for the sake of the harmony. Now the harmony was gone. All that was left was the truth. And Charlie began to talk. He started in interviews, tentatively at first. He would hint at the troubles with Ira. He would talk about the drinking. He would talk about the fights. He was, piece by painful piece, dismantling the very sacred image he had spent his youth protecting. Why? Because he finally understood. His trauma was his only story left. His identity was not Charlie Louvin, the solo star. He could never be that. His identity was Charlie Louvin, the survivor. This process, this public reckoning, this self-exorcism culminated in the ultimate act of compensation. He began to write his autobiography. This book was not a typical celebrity memoir. It was not a tell-all full of gossip about other stars. It was a confession. It was a raw, brutal, unflinching, and terrifying look at the hell that he and his brother had lived. It was his final testimony, the terrible human truth behind the angelic, sacred sound. He finally publicly told the stories he had hidden for 50 years. The stories of Ira's violent, drunken rages. The story of Ira smashing his mandolin to splinters on the Opry stage, screaming about the devil's music, the story of Ira trying to strangle him with a telephone cord in a hotel room, the story of his wife Faye shooting Ira 6 times in a drunken domestic war, and Ira surviving, like a character from a horror film. And he gave the book the only title that was possible, the title of their most famous, most chilling, and most autobiographical album. He called it Satan is Real. This book was his compensation. It was his final true legacy. It was the good brother, finally, at the end of his life, admitting that the angel he sang with was also the demon he had fled. And this is where the final tragic irony of Charlie's life snaps into focus. In 2001, as he was in the long, slow, painful process of telling this dark, complex, and human truth, he received his highest honor. He was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame, but he was not inducted as Charlie Louvin. He was inducted forever as one half of the Louvin brothers. Think of this. His ultimate triumph, his immortality, was not a celebration of his survival. It was a restoration of the lie. He was, in death and in history, reshackled to the very man, the very abuser, the very ghost he had spent the last 35 years of his life trying to exorcise. His solo identity, his pain, his survival, all of it was, once again, overshadowed by the terrible, beautiful, perfect harmony. The good brother would, in the end, be remembered only as a brother. This was the final devastating and perfect tragedy of his life. Charlie Louvin's reckoning with his past, his final transformation from harmony singer to survivor, defined the last chapter of his life. He had, in a way, found peace. He had accepted his fate. He was no longer chasing the ghost. He was instead explaining the ghost to the rest of the world. He was the curator of his own tragedy. He performed at the Opry almost every week, a beloved living link to the very foundation of the genre. He was Mr. Charlie. In 2010, the man who had survived poverty, who had survived the Great Depression, and who had survived the psychological and physical violence of his own brother, was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He faced his final battle with the same weary, pragmatic resilience that had defined his entire life. He continued to perform even as the illness ravaged his body. He died on January 26, 2011, at the age of 83. And Melba Montgomery, the sassy, tough woman who had refused to be a ghost, her victory was complete. Her 1974 hit, No Charge, had given her the financial independence and the respect she had craved her entire life. She, too, became a beloved member of the Opry, a pioneering songwriter whose empowerment anthems had paved the way for generations. She was the survivor who had won. As a testament to her resilience, she outlived almost all of her legendary troubled male partners. But the final, ultimate validation came in 2023, 52 years after her failed duet with Charlie Louvin. The industry that once dismissed her as too rough finally bowed down. Melba Montgomery was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. She did not enter with Jones or Louvin or even her brothers. She entered at last as she had always fought to be, completely, powerfully, and undeniably alone. Her victory is complete. She stands today as the living embodiment of that win, a final quiet bow from one of the last true female outlaws, a woman who faced down the industry's bias and won. So, what is the final verdict on their brief, forgotten duet? The lie is that it was a failure. The lie is that it was a commercial flop, a minor footnote in 2 major careers. The truth is that their duet was perhaps the most important, necessary, and successful moment in both of their lives. It was not a partnership. It was a pivot. It was the painful, necessary, and ultimately healing moment when 2 of country music's greatest survivors, Both veterans of toxic, abusive, and controlling partnerships finally let go. For Melba, it was her final test, the moment she proved she would not be molded, controlled, or overshadowed by any man, not even a Louvin. It was the act of defiance that cleared the path for her to receive no charge and claim her own crown. And for Charlie, it was the final heartbreaking rejection he needed to hear. It was the moment the public, the industry, and his new partner all told him the same terrible, liberating truth. Ira was gone. The harmony was dead. And he could, at last, stop singing with a ghost. Their brief collaboration was not a failure. It was an exorcism. And in that failure, both, for the first time in their lives, finally found the one thing they had been fighting for all along: themselves.